This story was told to me by Mr. Vincent, a man who grew up in a small rural community in the mountains of Montana. It was one of those cold October nights when he decided to share this story, a memory from his childhood that he could never forget. It happened back in the 1950s when he was just a little boy. The town was surrounded by dense forests and mountains, a beautiful place but full of mystery. At that time, stories of witches were common among the inhabitants. They called them the witches of the Rocky Mountains, women who, according to the tales, could transform into animals, disappear in a gust of wind, and, worst of all, liked to steal children. Mr. Vincent remembers that for weeks, there were rumors of disappearances in neighboring towns. Parents became more protective and did not let children play outside at night. Superstition and fear took hold of everyone. People claimed that witches came down from the mountains to take the little ones and use them in their dark rituals. It all happened one night when the full moon illuminated the Rocky Mountains like a cold white eye watching from the sky. Vincent, at 10 years old, was in bed next to his brothers, trying to sleep. Meanwhile, the dogs of the town were howling in the distance. He felt an inexplicable fear, as if something was lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, the wind began to blow strongly, shaking the branches of the trees and making the old beams of the house creak. Vincent heard his mother praying in a low voice, with a rosary in her hands, her voice trembling with each word. His father got up and closed all the windows, making sure they were well barred. That night, not far from Vincent's house, in a humble cabin on the edge of the forest, something happened that no one in the town would ever forget. The Thompson brothers, some children, disappeared without a trace. According to the children's parents, they had been sleeping peacefully when a strange cold wind blew through the cracks in the window. The mother woke up feeling a chill, and when she turned on the oil lamp, she saw something that made her scream in terror. The bed where their children had been was empty. The parents and neighbors searched everywhere, with lanterns and machetes in hand, entering the darkness of the forest. The strong and brave men, who used to joke about the stories of witches, were pale with fear. They walked in silence, listening to the whispers of the wind and the creaking of the branches. Deep in the mountains, they found a trail of small steps that went even deeper into the forest. But of the little ones, there was not a single trace. That night, Vincent swore that he heard strange laughter in the wind, laughter that did not seem human. The next day, the parents of the little ones were inconsolable. The entire town was plunged into fear. Nobody spoke of what happened that night, but everyone knew who the witches of the Rocky Mountains had been. He says that for days, the inhabitants of the town heard the crying of the children between the trees. They said that the witches had them in the mountains, using them for their rituals. The women of the town began to leave offerings at the crossroads, praying in secret, begging for the protection of their children. The rumors in the town grew quickly after the disappearance of the Thompson brothers. The old gossips whispered about pacts and women who practiced witchcraft in the mountains. It was not the first time that someone spoke of witches in the town. The stories of women who dedicated themselves to the dark arts and met deep in the forest were something that was passed down from generation to generation. They said that these women were responsible for the ruined crops and sick cattle. And the most terrifying thing is that they were also behind the disappearances. After the disappearance of the Thompson brothers, the men of the town decided that they could not sit idly by. Led by Mr. Michael, the father of the missing children, they organized a search in the mountains. The children's mother was devastated, and her pain was palpable every time someone passed in front of the house. The expedition to the forest was not an easy decision. That area had a reputation for being dangerous, not only because of the stories of witches, but also because of the wild animals and treacherous terrain. However, the fear of the unknown and the desire to find the little ones led the men to take the risk. Before leaving, they armed themselves with machetes, rifles, and flashlights. Some carried amulets and crosses, more out of tradition than true belief in their power. They walked for hours deep into the thick of the forest. The atmosphere was tense, and the silence of nature only contributed to their uneasiness. It seemed that even the animals had hidden, as if they felt the presence of something else in the area. As they advanced, the forest became denser and the air heavier. Upon reaching a small clearing surrounded by twisted trees, the men stopped. It was a place that the elders of the town had described as cursed, a place where, according to the stories, the witches met to carry out their rituals. The ground was covered with dry leaves and branches, and in the center of the clearing, they found the remains of a bonfire surrounded by strange symbols drawn in the ground. While exploring the area, they found small objects that made Mr. Michael's stomach turn. He recognized them as part of his children's clothing. It was then that he understood that the stories, as absurd as they seemed, could have some truth. Something or someone had taken the children, and not with good intentions. However, they found no traces of life in the clearing. The men returned to the town empty-handed, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and rage. There were no witches or dark rituals that they could see, but the fact that the children had disappeared without a trace reinforced the belief that something dark was afoot. As the days went by, the rumors in the town became more intense. Some claimed to have seen strange lights in the mountains during the night, while others claimed to hear laughter and whispers in the wind coming down from the mountains. No one wanted to admit it, but the fear of the unknown was affecting everyone. The children's mother locked herself in the house, and her health was rapidly deteriorating from the pain. The townspeople began to take extreme precautions, keeping their children always close and avoiding going out at night. The town church began to fill more than ever, and the priest, although bewildered, tried to calm the people with sermons and prayers. It was not long before the case of the Thompson brothers became a warning. The townspeople knew that something sinister lived in the mountains, something that could not be explained with logic or faith. Over time, the stories faded away, but the fear of witches remained. The men who participated in the search for the children never spoke openly about what they saw in the mountains. Some, over the years, suggested that it could have been the work of people who practiced rituals or even a sect. But no one ever knew for sure what happened to the Thompson brothers. What was clear is that the mountains, with their shadows and whispers, hold secrets that perhaps it is better not to discover. Mr. Vincent grew up with the warning to never go out alone to the forest, especially during full moon nights. Now, so many years later, sitting in front of me, Mr. Vincent remembers those days with a shiver in his voice. The children never appeared, and the witches of the Rocky Mountains became a legend, one that is still told today in the town. So, if you ever pass by those lonely roads of the mountains of Montana and feel a cold wind whispering your name, remember the story of the witches of the Sierra. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. This story has been heard by Mr. Edward, a retired taxi driver from the city of Portland. At 70-something years old, you could notice a gleam of fear in his eyes as he remembered that night in the 1970s when an unexpected encounter left a mark on him that would never be erased. It was a humid and hot night, typical of Portland, when Mr. Edward was making his last trip before finishing his shift. It was already after 10 p.m., and most people were in their houses. He was driving through the half-empty streets, thinking about returning home, when a woman appeared on the corner of an avenue. She raised her hand to stop him. Mr. Edward stopped the taxi, and the woman got into the back seat. Her face was covered by a kind of black veil, but what he could see of her gave him a chill. Her eyes were dark and deep, like two bottomless pits, and her skin seemed pale and lifeless. She wore dark but elegant clothes, a strange contrast in a city where people usually wore light clothing. According to what he said, it seemed like she had quite a bit of money. "Take me to Maple Grove," said the woman with a soft but authoritative voice. Mr. Edward couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. Maple Grove was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Portland, home to well-off families and businessmen. It wasn't the typical place where you would expect a woman as strange as her to want to go at that time of night. Throughout the trip, the woman didn't say another word. She just looked out the window, as if she were searching for something in the dark. Mr. Edward tried not to look at her in the rearview mirror, but every time he did, he found her watching him with those cold and empty eyes. They finally arrived at Maple Grove. Large and luxurious houses rose on both sides of the street, with well-kept gardens and high walls that protected the privacy of the inhabitants. "Stop here," ordered the woman when they arrived in front of one of the largest houses. Mr. Edward stopped, and the woman handed him a bill, paying him generously for the trip. But before getting out of the car, she gave him a fixed look. "Wait for me here. I won't be long," she said. Before he could answer, she got out of the taxi and headed to the house. Mr. Edward remained silent, confused, and a little scared. There was something in the way she had spoken to him, in those eyes that seemed to pierce through him, that made him feel like he had no other option. So he waited. The minutes seemed eternal, only interrupted by the soft whisper of the wind and the sound of nocturnal insects. About 20 minutes passed when curiosity got the better of his fear. He got out of the car and approached the gate of the house, trying to see through the windows. The house was illuminated, and although he couldn't see anything from his position, he could hear voices. There were several women whispering and laughing in a way that made his skin crawl. Without being able to contain himself, he slipped around the side of the house, finding a small space between the bushes. From there, he could spy on the interior. Inside the great hall, there were several women dressed in black, all with their faces covered by veils. The woman he had picked up in the taxi was in the center, surrounded by others. They were speaking in a language that Mr. Edward could not understand. But as he listened, he said it was something guttural and ancient, something that did not sound like any language he had heard before. In the center of the room, on a low table, there was a small figure wrapped in cloth. Mr. Edward could not distinguish what it was, but the shape and size made him think it was a doll or perhaps an animal. The women began to move around the table with slow and ceremonial steps, raising their hands towards the ceiling from time to time. Then, the woman he had picked up in the taxi took something out of her bag. It was a dagger with a long and shiny blade, decorated with strange symbols. Mr. Edward's heart beat strongly as he watched this scene. He knew that he should leave, that he should not be witnessing this, but something kept him glued to the place, unable to move. The women began to sing a monotonous chant that was intensifying. The leader, the woman who had apparently brought them together, raised the dagger above her head, pronounced a few words in that strange language, and then, with a quick movement, lowered the dagger towards the figure on the table. Mr. Edward held his breath. The figure on the table did not move, but a strange sensation filled the air, as if a current of energy had been released. The women laughed and began to clap softly, as if they had achieved what they wanted so much. The taxi driver felt dizzy, as if the air had become more tense and difficult to breathe. He slowly backed away, very carefully not to make noise. His mind was full of questions but no answers. He wanted to run away from that place, but he knew he had to wait for that woman. He did not know why, but something told him he had to take her back. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the front door opened. The woman got out, and Mr. Edward ran back to the taxi. He sat behind the wheel, trying to control the shaking of his hands. The woman got into the car without saying a single word, as if nothing strange had happened. She settled in the back seat and looked at Mr. Edward with those dark eyes. "Let's go back," she said simply. Mr. Edward nodded and started the car. During the return trip, he felt a pressure on his chest, as if an invisible weight was oppressing him. He did not dare to look in the rearview mirror, fearing to meet those eyes again. When he arrived at the place where he had picked her up, the woman got out of the car without thanking or saying goodbye. She walked away down the dark street and disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a cold air and a disturbing silence. Mr. Edward never knew exactly what he had witnessed that night. The figure on the table, the chants, the dagger, everything was an enigma. What he did know was that something strange had happened in that house in Maple Grove. He did not speak of it again for quite some time, fearing that no one would believe him or, worse yet, that the same woman would appear again to silence him. That night remained engraved in his memory as a reminder that in this world, there are things that are better not to understand or witness, things that, even in the most well-off and apparently quiet neighborhoods, can hide the true nature of darkness. This story was told to me by Margaret, a retired nurse who worked in a rural hospital in the 1970s. For years, she kept quiet about what she witnessed one night on duty when something inexplicable happened in the maternity ward. Even today, she remembers every detail with a shiver running down her spine. She said it was a night like any other in the hospital. Margaret was in charge of the newborn wards, taking care of the babies while their mothers rested. The hospital was not large and the staff was scarce, so during the nights, only a few nurses stayed, along with one doctor on call. Margaret didn't mind working during the nights. She was used to the silence and calm that the dark hours brought. But that night, the calm was different. It had a strange weight, as if something was lurking in the shadows. It was around 2:30 in the morning when she began to hear noises in the hallway. At first, she thought it was the wind, which often made the old windows of the hospital creak. But then, the noises became clearer, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. Margaret got up from her desk and went outside to the hallway, where the dim light of the lamps barely illuminated the corridor. There was no one there, only the sound of her own footsteps and the sound that faded away towards the corner. She returned to the maternity ward and made sure that everything was in order. The babies were sleeping peacefully in their cribs, rocked by the soft hum of the monitoring machines. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Maybe it was just her imagination. However, she couldn't help but feel watched, as if invisible eyes were observing her from the darkness. She decided to take a walk through the hospital corridors, as she did from time to time, just to make sure that everything was in order. When she reached the door that led to the back patio, she stopped. There was something in the window. At first, she thought it was just a reflection, but then she realized it was a face. It was a pale and aged face, with dark and empty eyes that were staring at her. Margaret stood paralyzed, unable to move or scream. That figure in the window disappeared in an instant, as if it had vanished into the air. Margaret felt a shiver run through her body and ended up running back to the maternity ward, her heart pounding. When she entered, she noticed that something was wrong. The temperature in the room had dropped, and there was a strange feeling, as if the air had become heavy and dense. She approached the cribs to check on the babies, and it was then that she saw it. A dark shadow was moving between the cribs, like a black mist that snaked through the air. Margaret wanted to scream, but fear had her trapped. She stood there, watching as the shadow stopped next to the crib of a newborn, one of the smallest and most fragile babies in the room. The shadow began to take shape, and Margaret felt her blood drain away. It was a woman, or at least that's what it looked like. She was wearing a black dress, and her hair was long and disheveled. Her face was a mask of wrinkles, and her eyes were sunken, but they shone with a sinister light. The figure extended a hand to the baby, with long, bony fingers. At that moment, Margaret knew she had to do something. She gathered all the courage she had left, ran to the crib, and stood between the figure and the baby. She raised her arms, as if she could protect the baby just by her presence. This woman, this thing, stared at her, and Margaret felt those eyes piercing through her, filling her with a primal fear. "You're not taking him away," Margaret said with a trembling voice, trying to sound as confident as she could. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it made a low, guttural sound, a kind of growl that made Margaret's skin crawl. The nurse groped for something she could defend herself with and found a crucifix hanging on the wall. She took it and raised it towards the figure. "In the name of God, get away," she said firmly. The figure slowly backed away, as if the crucifix was burning it. Then, without warning, it vanished into the air, leaving behind a smell of sulfur and wet earth. Margaret ended up falling to her knees, shaking and sweating cold. The babies began to cry at the same time, as if they sensed the evil that had been present. The doctor on duty and the other nurses came running, hearing the cries. They found Margaret on the floor, holding the crucifix with trembling hands, unable to explain what had happened. The others thought that she had had some kind of hallucination, that the tiredness had played a trick on her. But Margaret knew perfectly well what she had seen. She knew that it was not a dream. From that night, Margaret never returned to work the night shift. Rumors began to circulate through the hospital. stories about a witch who tried to steal newborns for her rituals. Some said that it was the spirit of a woman who had died in the hospital years before, while others believed that it was a real witch, someone who lived on the outskirts of the town and sought to lengthen her life through dark practices. Margaret kept silent about what she really saw that night, but every time she heard a baby cry, she felt a knot in her stomach. She knew that whatever had tried to steal the newborn was still out there, waiting for the opportunity to try again. And although many did not believe her, she was sure that in the world, there are things that we cannot understand, things that hide in the shadows.